Very well, we can start our Q&A session and discussion, which will be moderated and introduced by Federica Cavalletti, who is here at my right side. Federica is a PhD candidate in humanities at the Catholic University of Milan. Her research project, Cinema as a Time Lab, explores time perception in movies, combining theoretical speculation with empirical evidence from cognitive psychology and microphenomenology. And at the moment, she is working at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. So Federica will start our discussion, and then we will leave room for questions to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so I will try to say shortly something that brings together some of the hints provided by Professor Pinotti and some of the points touched upon by Professor Berthaud. So in the introduction, we have been speaking of illusions, of very fragile thresholds between images and reality. And when thinking about what Professor Pinotti showed across his presentation, we keep suggesting that virtual environment and actual ones, digital avatars and human beings are almost the same things. Yet at the same time, we imply that they are not exactly the same thing. We imply a quasi that expresses well the ambiguity of such situations and such images and constitute an effective keyword to group them. Such quasi, however, also comes, in my opinion, with two risks that I will try to reformulate here as questions and starting point for discussion. The first risk of this quasi is that of a renewed dualism. And for those of you who tried, think about the contradictory experience of wearing a VR headset and being in someone else's shoes or on the top of a skyscraper. We know we are not there, and yet we feel like we are. And it's tempting in such situations to go back to a dichotomist dualist speech by suggesting that our body tells us something and our mind something else, or even that the body tells us something wrong, which the mind corrects, so reestablishing an untimely idea of superiority of the mind over the body. How do we avoid this? And this is my first question to the speakers and to the audience. The second risk of the quasi is that of our renounce to differentiation. So the surprise we experience when faced with quasi-world and quasi-human beings might indeed make us less critical. So we might be tempted again to group too many things, too many kinds of images under the label of the quasi-real. Therefore, it might be time for a closer inspection, time to start observing differences within the, up to this point, unitary field of the quasi-real. And I think Professor Pinotti's genealogical effort is highly relevant in such respect. It's important to acknowledge that precedent exists. Avatars and immersive images existed way before contemporaneity, and they have changed. What might be the conceptual tools to fully grasp the actual terms of such change, to describe it with enough precision? Do we need new ones, new concepts, and new tools? And most probably, the conceptual distinction drawn by Professor Berthaud are helpful here. Different avatars and different environments could either trigger sympathy or empathy, egocentric or allocentric attitudes. When, however, does sympathy precisely turn into empathy? When do we shift from one spatial perspective to another, and why? And is there something in the images triggering this shift? And I think here lies a great opportunity for the dialogue between so-called hard sciences and the humanities, because the possibility to manipulate experimental conditions in the lab allows for formulating hypotheses in the humanities and then to test them in the lab. I also see here, however, a source of conflict that I will try to put as bluntly as possible. The humanities love complexity. Empirical investigation requires simplification. Scientists cannot simply bring people to the cinema, move them to a VR exhibition, and then compare the reactions in the two environments. Simplification is key, as we know, to obtain rigorous, controlled empirical data. Where scientists see rigor and control, however, humanists often see just reduction. So can we agree, can we settle on a degree of complexity that is satisfying to the humanities and manageable to empirical scientists? And these are my questions.
Thank you very much to the three of you for this very interesting first session of our conference. And my question is for Professor Berthoz and somehow prolongs what Federica just said in her remarks. When we study the interaction with the visual technologies from the point of view of film theory or media theory or visual culture theory, we very often emphasize the historicity of these kind of interaction, the historicity of experience and perception. And I wanted to know if in the, perhaps the question is a bit naive, but I wanted to know if in the experiments that you've been worked on, you always worked from a kind of a synchronic perspective, or whether you, in some cases, also took in account a diachronic dimension, meaning studying how, for example, neural activity changes through repeated interaction with different dispositives, including avatars and so on. Whether somehow the brain activity evolves, develops, transforms itself in time through the encounter, the repeated encounter with these technologies. So whether you always study brain activity from a kind of synchronic standpoint that somehow represents a kind of brain activity without keeping in account the passage of time and the possible transformations induced by technology.
Thank you. Well, this is, of course, a very important question, and I think that Mel Slater, who is sitting at the back, and Olaf Blanke would probably have a lot to say to answer this question, and they will maybe they can answer to that too, because this is really fundamental. Well, you know, one of my masters said, I have only 25 hands, and I can only deal with one question at a time. But you're right. No, there are several ways to take into account what you call the historicity. First of all, this is why I am personally, at least, very interested and lucky to be able to work with development and children, because that is one dimension, which is in which, of course, we immediately find what maybe you refer to. It's obvious from what we now have interaction with this multidisciplinary group of psychanalysts, psychologues, pedopsychiatrists, that when you try to look at these problems with children, we have to take into account the history. And also, you know, I have produced 2 books. One is on simplexity, which says that complexity is something, but evolution has allowed us to have simplex mechanisms. But I have another one on vicariance, because what has happened in France is that we have forgot that there was such a thing as a difference between all our brains. There was originally a very big school of la psychologie différentielle in France. And in my generation, we have been, in a sense, obliged to produce over the last 30 years papers which were dealing with the average subject. Basically, it was 30 subjects and the average. And fortunately, now there is a very interesting trend to find again what I call la vicariance. That is that all our brains are actually solving the same problem with very different processes. And the way our different brains, I'm trying to answer with a detour. Yeah. It's a simplex mechanism, apparent complexity. One of the reasons for which we all have this incredible diversity, which is for me the most interesting thing today, is that the way we interact and we solve these problems is going to depend upon our history, our culture. And that is why today, as I am a young retired professor, and I am starting my career, as you could imagine or guess. My main interest is exactly that. It is, you know, I have fights now with, when we look at data with the students or the colleagues, and I am more interested to see the diversity and the difference. And we don't have all the methodological tools and the theory. And that is why also I find that the interaction with social sciences that we have here, particularly in this institute, is so important. We found this problem with Itzhak Fried. You know, we have had here this program on syndromie. Syndromie is these people who can kill 50 people, throw them in a ditch and go back home, and they are very nice people. And this is not psychopaths, they are not serial killers. And we've been for 3 years with Grete Myrdal and Itzhak Fried bringing together here philosophers, historians, sociologists, to look at what appears to be two brains, you know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But it was very obvious, it is obvious that you cannot deal with this question of the behavior of these people. It's always in group, so then we have to have Alvax and group theory. It's always stereotypes, so it's basal ganglia. It's always with drugs, so it's habits. It's all the history and culture. So the question you ask is very deep, and that is why I am so interested to bring together on each of these experiments these different approaches. I have at the present time a project on le geste violent, but it is not. I worked with Éric Briand. He's a historian of sociology, and his wife Marie Gesson. And we have defined. It took us 1 year just to find the topic. Before we found the student who was able to go between sociology and neuroscience. And what we found was that the violent gesture is not very interested. Many of our colleagues are studying violence. La joie is not so interesting. Many of my friends are. What is interesting is the transition between this and this and this and this and this and this and this. Because it is at the transition that probably all the history, sociology criteria come into. For instance, some young guys who are in the, not in prison, but délinquants. For them, la bagarre is part of the game. You know, I was a worker in a factory for some months in my engineering school, and in the morning, my colleagues, the workers, they came and said, "Hello, Alain, comment ça va?" Okay, so that is the difficulty, and it takes. My model is that we have co-directed theses between two disciplines. We meet every month, and we have a triangle by which the two professors in disciplines learn as much as the students. Ça va? C'est difficile, mais il faut travailler. C'est central.
I wanted to ask you a question. Excuse me for my English. I will try. I was. Do we know if in neurodevelopmental process, do we know if sympathy? We learn sympathy first and then empathy, or do we know?
Well, no,
is there an order?
Well, yeah. Once more, I am not a specialist of child psychology. I am a learner, un étudiant de première année, avec mes amis pédopsychiatres. But, you know, the traditional view was that the child first has the egocentric perspective. And I've been working a lot from the Piaget work. Piaget had the famous experiment, des Trois Montagnes, with a puppet. It was an avatar already, the puppet. And he said that it was between 7 and 8 that the child acquired the capacity to change point of view. So that was the basis of all the work I've been doing for now 10 years with PISA Professor Cioni in Pisa particularly, and many of my friends, is looking at this period between 5 years to 12 at the acquisition. And we know that this is also the age where you start having these long connections between distributed and prefrontal cortex, etc. connections. So, but we thought it would be kind of something strict. But I have a paper with Jesse Boelens in Holland on this question, on a paradigm of navigation, where the conclusion was actually that children already at the age of 4 can use an allocentric coding, but in a primitive, let's say, form. I am summarizing. So the idea, you know, is very simple in a sense. Together with the development of the, c'est un peu réductionniste et neurophysiologiste, hein? Together with the progressive development of all the systems which I mentioned, which are involved in this manipulation of reference frames and also integration with emotion, then one can probably see development of more and more aspects. The other thing I want to say is that although in our field now we have this distinction between egocentric, allocentric, heterocentric, of course these distinctions are trivial. C'est sans doute plus compliqué que ça. For instance, I now work with Tamar Flash, who is here, and Daniel Benquin on the idea that the brain uses different geometries for body, for prehension space, for near space. And all these questions will probably have to be reformulated by all the young generation who is here, of which you belong, so that we get out of these probably too simple dichotomies. Voilà. Ça va? Mais il faut travailler.
Total outsider, but this is really fascinating. Has anybody studied the difference in reaction amongst people like me who grew up in a print and film culture and have never played a video game in my life? The only Avatar I've come across is in a film called Avatar. How we respond to these kinds of experimental situations, as opposed to people like my son, who spends hours a day playing video games.
So thank you very much for this question. I did not want to mention it in my talk, but Andrea probably will be interested that we mention it today. There is at the present time a working group of the French Academy of Science together with the Academy of Medicine and the Academy of Technology, which for the last 5 months have been reassessing the effect of les écrans, which is not a good way to, but the use of these virtual worlds, given that the average of people working, using these different ways are up to about 4 hours per day. It seems these are stupid numbers, but it seems that eventually the generation here is going to spend 18 years of their life in these worlds, and that the range is from 2 hours to 6 or 7 hours per day. And we had a report from the president of the French Pediatric Society, who gave us a report. He has a paper in Le Monde and reports, so I can mention it. And they studied children at about 5, 6 years of age. You know now, if you go to the restaurant, you see a young couple come. Each of them has his thing, and the mother gets the little tablet out and gives it to the child who is sitting on the baby chair, 2 or 3 years, so that they are quiet. Okay, so children from 2 to 5 use that. And the report is that there are 3 pathologies identified. First of all, attentional deficit with an hypnotism in the machine, probably which is related to this, what Andrea described, this attraction dans le monde. And when they get out from them, a difficulty to have a very flexible attention. So hypnosis and difficulty attention. Second, language because they don't have the interaction with the parents and the people, so they speak the language of the machine, and the third is une forme d'autisme, social interaction. So, and this is for kids with 6 or 7, and the same is coming out for adolescents. So there is a big problem, that the power of the immersion into these worlds and this fascination that Andrea Penotti introduced us as a universal, comment tu as dit?
Anthropological universal.
You
like it? Anthropological universal.
Anthropological universal, yeah. Is a big problem. Voilà. Fine.
But I would add, if I may, that I wouldn't worry about too strict interpretation of the avatar. As we speak of a broad autistic spectrum, we could also speak in an analogous way of a broad avatarial spectrum. Because, for example, if I think of cinema, you were talking of your cinematic experience, cinematographic experience, I can think of, for example, the typical first-person shot. So you have the shot as taken in a first-person perspective, and that is a way subjective shot. Yeah. And if you see the hand of the subject from which perspective you are seeing the scene, you have the hand, you have the arm, and these are kind of partial avatars of yourself, which invite you to identify with that kind of perspective.
But that's very rarely used.
It's very rarely used, but it's not. Federica has studied these kind of shots, and she has shown in a very interesting paper that there's a number of cases which is interesting. But
il y a une question là-bas.
Il y a une question. Oui.
Is on the level of brain, the perception of the avatar is the same as the perception of a real person? Does it depend on the fact that it's me who animate the avatar or someone else? And does it depend on the fact that it is realistic avatar or not realistic avatar?
So realistic or non-realistic? That's the question. I'm sure that once more, Olaf and Professor Slater should also participate in this discussion because they have been working on that long. It's a question on which we've been working with, which was asked to us already 20 years ago by the engineers in Électricité de France who use avatars for training in work conditions. I don't know. I don't have a definite answer. We have, with Etienne Armand-Amato and Etienne Perreny, in the experiment which I mentioned very quickly and on which maybe Etienne Armand-Amato could say a few words, we have tried to compare in the flying avatar what would happen if the subject would see his real body projected in the world, or if he would be a blue avatar, which would have the same movements but not be similar. But we have not, up till now, gone very far on that, and maybe Etienne Armand can at least mention a few things. So it is a very interesting problem, and I don't have any experiment in which we have done what you suggest, which is to grade. Maybe Mel, are you here, Mel? Have you done similar things? I'm sure he has.
So I can't answer at the level of the brain, but from some empirical data. So there's two different issues. One is body ownership of a virtual body, which is first-person perspective with you. You look down, you see a virtual body, you see it in a mirror. And all the evidence we have over many, many, many studies, including where we make the avatar a very good copy of your own body, it makes no difference. So you can be embodied in your own body, you can be embodied in a body with a different skin color, a different gender, looks completely different in many different ways. The body ownership is always high and the same. The multisensory integration more than the appearance. So if I look down and I see a body and I move and the body moves with me, or something touches my virtual body and I feel it correspondingly, this is the cue that I think body ownership works out of. So we haven't done a specific study to test that, but this is all the data we have. It's always like that. Now, the other side of the question that we haven't done studies on, it's just a lot of experience over many years, is how do you respond not to your own avatar, but to another avatar? And again, all the evidence suggests that the realism doesn't really matter. So if an avatar that doesn't look realistic comes over to you and smiles, you smile back. If it holds out its hand to shake hands with you, you'll hold out your hand to shake hands. So it's like, it goes back to one of the questions that Frederica raised at the beginning, which is to do with, you know it's not real, but nevertheless you respond as if it's real. And I think an analogy might, or quite a close analogy there might be that you can see 12 lines on a piece of paper, and you know they're 12 lines, but you can't but help see it as a cube. You can say, I know it's 12 lines, but you see a cube. And when you see an avatar coming towards you and acting towards you and so on, you know it's not real, but by the time you've said that to yourself, you've already responded. So I think it's just an illusion. Operates out of a perceptual illusion. You respond to the illusion, because if we think about it, that's the safe thing to do, because it might be real. As far as some level of the brain is concerned, it might be real. There might really be a person there. But a slower process is the thinking about it and the evaluation, which says, well, I know it's not real, but it's too late. I've already smiled back. I've already held out my hand to shake hands. Or I've already ducked because it looks like they're going to hit me. So that's...
Mel, sorry, is there an uncanny valley for avatars? Let me say, in robotics, there has been a similar problem at some point. Roboticians working with humanoids, they have tried to make the humanoids look more and more like people. And at some point, they describe what they call the uncanny valley phenomenon, is that people were happy when the robot started to look like real people. And at some point, when it started being really like real people, they were very unhappy. And so the problem, is it like the golem in our culture? And nobody has, there is many papers on what is the mechanism of this uncanny valley. I like one paper which was made by some Japanese group, which says that actually what may have happened is that these humanoid robots, they looked like a person, but they did not use in their program the natural laws of movement that Tamar has studied, so that they had movements which did not look like people. So that if you would make a humanoid look with the natural movements, then they would be happy. But I don't know, is there anything, Olaf or Mel, like the uncanny valley described for avatars?
Well, it hasn't been possible to do because we haven't been able to do real-time avatars that look extremely human. Now that's changing with these new volumetric techniques, but the problem with it, so that in other words, they do very, very powerful scans of people and they get a volumetric copy of a person. But the problem is with those, they're very difficult to do anything, to look at them as anything like 3D video. You can't interact with them, they just do what they do. So it's difficult to know, but I would agree with what you said. The only evidence that I know is there has to be a consistency between the appearance of the avatar and its behavior. So if the avatar looks really good, but it doesn't behave like a human, then this is more likely to be rejected.
Maybe just one quick addition on the neuroscience side, and maybe also induced by the uncanny valley. So I just wanted to say, from a neuroscience point of view, and Salvatore should probably comment on this as well, but the visual brain is monitoring very carefully whether this looks like the blue avatar in the Avatar movie, or whether it looks really like me, or whether there's a female avatar. It's me processing it. So the brain is monitoring all this. And it's a very easy discrimination to do, right? My brain activity discriminates between the activity. But when it's down to ownership manipulations or multisensory perception or mental transformation, then these visual mechanisms are not the most relevant ones. So although your brain has access to differentiating at the behavioral level and for ownership, there is no difference, because it's a different cognitive or own body transformation mechanism that is involved. So I would also second just that it is important how the body is represented, not what the body looks like. So if the body moves like me, if it has similar shape, if it has 2 arms, 2 legs, then that is something that is more important than the visual appearance.
So, in fact, in the media studies perspective, I try to develop with Etienne. Yes. In the media studies perspective, we think about identification and projection, not about empathy and sympathy. So, with the avatar, the main problem is you are in charge. You have to manage the activity of your avatar. So the control is very central, and usually they explain the scientific papers explain that if the context is dangerous, or if there is emergency or something difficult, there is an augmentation of projection or identification. It depends of the kind of style of people. And when we use self-avatar in our experience, we try to reduce the casual, the standard situation without game, without complex, dangerous things or other protagonists, only to have a simple activity to fly, explain Alberto. So we find with the video incrustation, there's no photometric problems, or everybody recognize himself, because when you move and you control also your avatar. So it's direct recognition, and the activity of fly show something very classical in culture, in your dream or in a super video, Superman heroes. Everybody know how to fly. So it works, in fact. The problem we have is to understand which mechanics, which patterns we mobilize. And usually people who dream in our life about fly, or who try to see themselves in dreams, have better sensation of fly. And we find also that people could reactivate experiences of fly. If you have, for example, a parachute, parapente, I don't know the name in English, but other experience, real experience of fly, you recognize. So we think avatar could be a good support of reactivation memories and the body sensation also. And the better situation, we try to make a study with a blue avatar, not yourself, and another way with yourself avatar. And we find everybody have also the feeling of fly with the blue avatar, because there's no problem, the activity is well recognized, but there's no so much auto-identification, so there is more distanciation, and all the question is how much distanciation about the activities we have. And usually the video games experts don't think it's a good system, because they are too much. They know too much the classical system, and the new beginners have better in immersion. So it depends of the profile. It's very individual aspect of, but it's clear that it's a pragmatical. Andrea Pinotti talk about representation a lot, but in avatar you have control, you have behavior and situation, and I think it's the main difference with all the narcissistic or proto-immersive. It's a point.
There was a question, I think, by Professor Cappelletto, and another one by Professor Flash.
Thank you. I think my question is much related to what you just said, because I was wondering if you ever recorded or measured somehow the difference between the experience that I can have when I deep into an empty space, like flying, for example, without any kind of avatar, and when there is my avatar who is flying. So, because to me, the two of them seems to be extremely different, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, you know, I have only very limited and recent experience on all this. You understand? That was not my 40 years of professional life. It's just my new career, in a sense. No, but this is what you say is what is called the difference between subjective view, first-person perspective, where you don't have any avatar, or when you have an avatar of yourself. That is your question. Did we see a difference, but a difference in what? In the experience that the subject has. Well, when you see in flying or just the visual, well, the situation where you are in a helmet and you see the scene move, this has been described for many, many years, and I've been actually the first to do the experiments on what was called linear vection, together with my friends in MIT, Larry Young. This was in the 50 years ago, 40 years ago. So this is a situation where the visual system sees the visual world move. This is a situation which is called vection. It's been described by the German, even a physicist many years ago. The brain, when the brain sees the visual world move, it has two possibilities. Either it is the visual world which moves, or it is you who move. This is the illusion of the train. When you are in the train, your train is immobile. The next one starts, you have the feeling you are starting. This is called vection. Now, this has been extensively studied in psychophysics, in neurophysiology. It does not involve only the visual cortex. It involves the superior colliculus. It involves what is called the accessory optic system. It triggers optic kinetics. So this is one situation in which you get self-motion perception. Okay, and it depends. So I have papers from my youth. It depends on the content of the visual world, spatial frequency. That is the number of items on the world, the number of items on the velocity, etc., etc. And we know the neuronal pathways for that. And it interacts also probably with all the system of the head direction cells, which complement in the hippocampus the place cells for us to know where we are and how we navigate. So all this is very well known. Now, when you have the avatar, this is a completely new problem. And my silence means that this is what we are all working on. And that is what we are looking at in the flying avatar. At the present time, my friends in La Cité have not only the standing avatar that you saw, but now they are looking at that together with a student who is sitting here. Kevin is going to do his thesis comparing these different conditions, because also it depends very much on whether you are immersed 360 degrees or whether you are on your smartphone. So the size of the visual field is going to be dependent, etc. Coaction is going to be done. So, beaucoup de travail pour les jeunes. Alors, c'est ça. Yeah, many potential projects here in this institute for interface between neuroscience and social sciences. Le rôle de l'histoire, la culture aussi. It's not going to be the same for Japanese and for us. Tamar.
I actually want to make a comment. So from my own experience and from what we know from neuroscience,
Professor Tamar Flash.
There is a very strong influence of motion. So the response that you elicit in a person that's watching the avatar, we had a study with Antonio Casile, Martin Gies, myself, other people, Eran Dayan. If you have an avatar that disobeys what we call our natural kinematic laws of motion, you disobey, you feel very unhappy. Something bothers you. But if the motion is very similar to what you do as yourself when you move, there is a big area of brain areas, including the mirror neurons, but other even what we call default mode network, a lot of different areas of the brain that are very important that give you a feeling. First of all, these brain areas are more active when you see motion that obeys the natural laws of motion versus non-natural. But also there is a recent paper by Ishiguro who talked about, he builds these very faces that look like himself, like Einstein, like whatever, very natural looking, very realistic. And he found that you can elicit an uncanny valley by distorting the motion.
Yeah, but
so I think
this is what was said in this Japanese paper 3 years ago.
So I think the motion is very important. Also the kind of motion you have. And also I think Professor Mel Slater had work on seeing somebody move in an isochronous way with yourself or not isochronous, right? And that also influences very much the response of the observer or the sense of feeling yourself in the body of others. So these are all seems to be tricky and small things, but I think they are very influential.
Synchronicity.
Synchronicity.
There was a question in the back since quite a long time, and also another question from...
Thank you for orienting me as my avatar in space.
Hi, I have a question regarding mental mind wander. So,
can you stand up, please?
Stand up, yes, of course. Hi, I have a question regarding mental mind wander and physical wander in the virtual world. So connected a bit to your comment about the default mode network. So I'm thinking that in the virtual worlds, there should be some sort of phenomenological, contextual difference in the content of one's thoughts in the immediate experience when you're sitting and imagining these virtual worlds and seeing yourself move in them. For instance, in, I don't know, the Apperly task or these other avatar tasks that is just a simple finger touch and you see these worlds and you try to project yourself in there, but you're not actually physically moving as you're engaging in these worlds. And then secondly, the physical wander where you were showing, for instance, in your experiment, that the individuals, the human subjects, are actually moving in that space. I asked that question because, firstly, I'm interested, can that elicit or create some more significant creative mind wanders? Because this is a big topic also in mind wandering research, is how we can elicit more creative thoughts and not just your everyday stressful type of thoughts. Can we actually inspire humans to wonder more as opposed to just respond immediately to stimulus? So would the physical wander in the virtual world inspire you to be more creative, or actually would it be rather projecting yourself in these virtual worlds just mentally and not physically moving elicit a more creative thought processes? I'm wondering how important it is to physically move in the world with your body too.
Can you summarize in one sentence your question?
In one sentence, okay. How much is physically moving in the world with your body important to just projecting yourself mentally in that world? So which one, how would those actually change our immediate thought contents? How are your immediate mind wanderings changed based on actually physically moving in the world as opposed to just mentally projecting yourself in that world?
Thank you. Andrea, what is nice is that this discussion is preparing so many questions to be thought about during the whole meeting, right? I have no answer to your question. I could have only speculations. But I'm sure somebody in the room has an answer.
It's also connected to...
Do you have one? I'm wondering if you have... Well, no, you know, for instance, what the situation is described is the situation we have when we watch a cinema, the movie, right?
Exactly. So I thought that maybe that experiment you did with the cinema movie, she's kind of talking about that situation where she's not physically moving, but she's feeling a lot.
I think somebody has an answer. You may. I don't know.
Just a comment on it. I've made a virtual world in which you can wander around forever. Like, it's really big. No, you move. You're physically moving, and there's no time pressure. You can just walk around and explore things at your own pace. And I would love you to try it and tell me what's your... He's tried it. But it's all about wandering physically in this world. So, and also meeting other avatars on the platform. No, I'm doing it as an art piece, so I don't really collect data right now. But I would be very happy to, if somebody is interested.
I have a very naive question for Andrea Pinotti, actually. Thinking of what Professor Bertozzi was saying about the importance of the nature of the space in deciphering the movement from the ego perspective to the allo perspective, allocentric perspective. Do you actually think that even in the immersive experience, the very nature of the threshold matters in any way? I mean, if you have an immersive experience through a mirror, a screen, a layer of water, or a door, do you think it's different or not, or doesn't count?
I think that it might enhance the subjective feeling of immersion if in the virtual immersive environments you are offered a symbolic element of threshold. For example, as you said, a door, a mirror, or something, or a bridge, something that you have to trespass. So I think, of course, I have no data, but I guess that this might enhance, of course, your subjective feeling of being in the image, of operating in the image, and of trespassing the threshold. Yes, I think so. Perhaps, Etienne?
Yeah, a question here.
Also,
Andrea?
Giacomo.
Yes. I think about avatar topics, there is well-known effect. The name is Proteus effect. It's important to discuss about the feedback of the avatar properties under the user. If you manage a monster, or maybe I am a man, a woman, what kind of feedback or learning or lessons I could find inside this experience. And usually we have to understand that the avatar are used during thousand hours. There is evolution of the character in video games, mainly in massively multiplayer role-playing games. And this attachment, this big invest inside character have a lot of impact about eventually everyday life. If you find some new skills, new social skills, but also psychological skills. So we have to understand the difference between yourself and the character in action in a fictional world, because we have all the question of serious game or how to convert experience of virtual worlds in our worlds, and it's the main point I want to discuss maybe later.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for all the ideas that came from this discussion. I have an observation for Andrea, but for everybody, because just recently I saw, I live in Venice, so I was on this boat, and there was this mother with a little children, maybe 2, under 3 years old, holding this tablet or telephone without any problem. So the children was like 2 in the stroller, and apparently the mother knew that the children couldn't let the tablet or the phone fall, because they would risk to lose the phone in the water. I was on the boat, so even stronger than the...
J'ai pas compris.
I was on a boat in Venice, and there was a little children in the stroller who was holding a tablet.
Yeah.
So the danger of losing the tablet, because the children, I know, they throw things, they throw toys when normally, and they have fun, to take back. So this hypnotic, or I don't know how to call this, power of the moving image It's bringing something new, truly, to what you were saying.
Thank you.
And then I was thinking, you showed us experiments, very interesting, where the control groups, but where the differences established, if I understood well, are between normal persons and people who have different kind of disabilities. Yeah. Are there any experiments where you check also persons who have abilities like dancers or expert video game players? And just the last remark, then I leave you. I was wondering, listening to all the discussion, if we could think about vision as a sense, biologically, not as something that bring us towards the outside, but maybe as a more as a control feedback that works on our proper perception, even at the level of phylogenetically. If we think at the moment where we were worms in the ocean, and where the sense of sight appeared evolutionarily, if this sense was a sense used by that mythical life to see, to know something about the surroundings, or more about or something that he used to know something more about itself. So.
Okay, two questions.
Two, three, many.
Two questions. So the first one, I got lost with the first one. What was your first question?
More than a question, it's just an observation.
No, but you had the first question.
The question is, it was about if in the experiments you make, you check also groups of persons who have strong abilities, motion abilities, like dancers.
That is what Etienne Armand was mentioning. At least in our experiments, we are looking very carefully in the two groups, both on the avatar, flying avatar, and on the experiment with François Garnier on the museum. We are looking at experts and non-experts. That is, computer fanatics and non-fanatics. So actually, this is where at the present time the greatest differences come. We have even in the museum, we were looking at the data last week. There was a strange observation. We have 50 students in these museums, and it was very strange, but maybe Etienne Armand has the answer, I don't know. We found that experts have more higher heartbeat when they have to observe different pictures than the non-experts. So in cardiac frequency, the problem is the interpretation is very difficult. So they are different. No, the only thing I want to mention is an old paper, which was, this relates with what Tamar Flasch was saying. There is a very nice paper relating to your question from Julie Grèze, together with Passingham in London some years ago. They looked at the mirror system, not mirror neuron, but the whole system. They had in the fMRI two groups of dancers, either capoeira dancers or classical dance. And they showed to these dancers either people dancing the dance they would know or dance they would not know. And they did show, once more, it's obvious, but it had to be shown, that the whole mirror system, in other words, the ability for the brain to simulate mentally the action of the observed avatar, it was a kind of avatar, was greater if you would know. Like, here, I'm not sure many of the ladies here play rugby. Generally, I have an audience with rugby, with mainly men. But when there is a majority of guys, I say that those who play rugby, when they watch the TV and see the rugby player, now we know from this experiment that they will simulate mentally better the game of the rugby than if they are football players. So this is done. Now for your the other question concerning evolution, I think we should discuss it during lunch. It's a very interesting question. I'm very happy you mentioned that. The only problem is that remember that we have many visual systems. We have 5 visual systems, 4 or 5. We have the cortex, we have the colliculus, we have the direct pathway to the amygdala. So what visual system are we talking about?
5.
Some of the systems go directly to the nucleus of optic tract, concern the body. So your question would deserve, it's very interesting, but it would deserve discussing a bit more in depth. Okay?
Alain, I think that you have earned your lunch.
No, thank you for everybody for the discussion.
Thank you very much for the discussion.
Thank you for you.
And to Federica for having introduced it.